And now comes the fun part. I'm going to begin by removing the entire rear portion of my Traxxas Slash from the chassis. That is the rear suspension, rear shock tower, the entire transmission from the chassis. But before I begin, I want to point something out, a little tip for you. You can see here in the top of my rear shock tower, I've drilled 2 holes. The reason is that there are 2 screws holding the rear shock tower to your chassis. They're pretty much impossible to see in my video here, but trust me, they're there. And they'd be really difficult or impossible to remove without having to remove this top of your shock tower. So what you'd have to do is remove 4 screws, take off this top of your shock tower, and then you'd have access. So by drilling these 2 holes, what I could do is take my driver, slip it through those holes, and go have a straight shot to each of those 2 screws. It does not compromise the strength of your shock tower. Believe me, I'm not the greatest driver. I end up with my lid a lot, but it does save you some time, makes it a lot easier. So what I'll start doing is with my 2mm hex driver and my Black & Decker screwdriver, or motorized screwdriver. I'm going to begin by removing these 2 screws here, and then the 2 screws here. Those 4 screws hold the rear shock tower to the chassis. Okay, done removing those 4. Next, you want to remove these 2 screws here. They also have a 2mm head. What I like to do is, once I remove screws, try to put them right back where I took them from, so I don't forget where I got them, or so I don't lose them. And I usually just hand tighten them back in their original location. Of course, I won't be needing these again. Now I've removed the entire rear portion of my Traxxas Slash. It'll be a little easier to work with, not having to deal with this much larger part. Taking care not to lose any of the screws here that I've already removed. What I like to do next is remove the rear bumper. And I do that by removing this screw and this screw, each with a 2mm head. This one right down here with a 2mm head. Anyway, it's off. We're going to proceed by removing this portion here from our transmission case. And it's this part here that gives the Slash a tie center of gravity by offsetting the chassis, pushing it up further rather than having it down here. So, to do that, we took off 6 screws. These 2 here with 2mm heads on them, and 1, 2, 3, 4 with 2.5mm heads on them. And there you go. Now, alternatively, you don't have to go in the exact order I did. You could have left this mounted on your chassis and just removed the suspension and transmission case. I chose to just remove it from the chassis first so I didn't have to deal with that larger piece. Now you don't need this. But again, just so I don't misplace my screws, I'm going to gently hand thread them back. We are now going to proceed by removing the front steering and suspension from the stock Traxxas Slash chassis. And I will start by removing these 3 screws that hold the bumper brace. These 2 outer screws are 2mm heads, and this middle screw has a 2.5mm hex head. Okay, I've got those 3 screws removed. I'm going to continue by removing these 2 2mm screws from the chassis. Alright, and then to finalize removal of this part from your Traxxas chassis, we have 4 more screws to remove. These 2 here, which have 2.5mm heads. And then finally, we're going to remove 2 more longer screws from our steering. But first, now you'll see that the one thing holding this part to your needed components are these 2 screws here that hold your steering bell crank mechanism to this black part of your old chassis. So we'll remove those 2. So now what you can do, pull out those long screws. They have washers on them. Be sure to keep these washers. And then this part of your chassis just slips out. And you're done removing it. Now, just as an FYI, in addition to the washers that are on these longer screws that connect your bell crank to this piece here, there are also 2 washers, 1 on each post. I dropped one earlier, but you want to keep them. Keep them on these posts in case you decide to use them later on. To finalize the removal of your front end components, you're going to have to take off this bumper brace, because beneath it are 2 other screws with 2.5mm heads on them. So to remove this bumper brace, there are 2 2.5mm screws holding it to the bumper. So we're going to remove those. There's your bumper brace, which you will not be needing. And you can set these screws aside for later use. Now that reveals these 2 screws, which also have 2.5mm heads on them. Take those off, and the entire front end will then be released from the chassis. There you go. I'm going to place those 2 screws back, again, just so I don't lose them, so I know where they came from. And now what we can do is begin installing these components onto our LCG chassis.